Hello, everybody, and welcome. I think we'll get started right about now. We are May 20th. Thanks for joining us here. We were gonna put in what week this was of this COVID-19 pandemic, but I know as many of you guys can relate to, it's kind of hard to keep track. I know from all the panelists that we have here today, all of them kind of have different perspectives, and everyone has been affected differently, and I'm sure everyone out there has been affected differently. But I think today, everybody that's in the audience can all kind of relate to the topic of analytics in construction, how we can use that to navigate this economic uncertainty, right? So I know everyone's got a little bit of different perspectives. Every construction company is a little bit different, but contractors are having to make some tough decisions out there. And during this time, those best decisions generally are a result of informed decisions. And that dovetails into analytics in a lot of ways. And we're lucky to be joined by some really, really talented and some really, really knowledgeable people today to kind of help guide that conversation. Hopefully you guys can take some information out of this and walk away a little bit more informed with all this stuff going on. So my name's Eric Vitardi. I'm from Foundation Software. I'm lucky to be joined by a large group, which we'll get into introducing here in a second. But as we get into some logistics, I just want to let you guys know, keep an eye on that Q&A. We are doing this live, so bear with us, as I'm sure you guys have done a lot of Zoom calls and webinars yourselves there. So, bear with the group. We're getting out there, and we wanted to get this put together as quickly as possible for you, given the timeliness of the topic. So we're doing it live. If you have any questions, pop them in that Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the bottom. We'll see what we can get to, but other than that, this will be recorded as well, although we're doing it live. Take a look. If you don't get an email as a follow-up, feel free to reach out to Bruce at ProNovos, who I'm going to introduce here in a second, for any follow-up recording or anything like that. So now that we got the logistics out of the way, we'll kick it over. As I mentioned, we got a really, really good group of panelists today. Maybe we'll start with Wick Zimmerman. Wick is the CEO of Outside the Lines. Outside the Lines is a contracting organization based in California. And they have a regional office in Texas as well. Additionally, we have Bryce Wisen, who is a partner at Eide Bailly. Dr. John Killingsworth, professor at Colorado State University. And he provides industry training in construction financial management and project level cash flow management. And then last but not least, as I alluded to earlier, Bruce Orr, the Chief Data Scientist at ProNovos Construction Analytics. And just a big thank you, on behalf of Foundation, myself, for ProNovos for helping to put this together, Colorado State, Eide Bailly, and Outside the Lines. I can't thank each of the individuals as well as the representative organizations enough for helping to put this together rather quickly. So thanks for joining, everybody. And I think maybe, since we're talking about it, we're talking about construction analytics, maybe we just start off with the basic. I think that makes the most sense. So maybe we'll start with, what does analytics mean to you? Bryce, you want to maybe pick that one up?
Data analytics is a process of cleansing, integrating, transforming, and modeling data in order to discover useful information, to inform conclusions, and to support decision making. Today, we have more data from more sources than we've ever had before. In fact, some people estimate that more data has been created in the last 2 years than in all of previous recorded history. So analytics uses data extraction and warehousing systems, and then various statistical algorithms, and then visual tools to really help us harness the tsunami of data in order to help us make better business decisions. In the construction industry, we lag some of the other industries, and as a result, have the opportunity to, in terms of data analytics adoption and usage, but that gives us the benefit of being able to leverage lessons learned in other industries. And my personal belief is that the winners in the next stage of business will be those that effectively use data to help them optimize their business operations.
That's an awesome perspective, Bryce. Maybe in Wick, if you're with us, maybe you can, I think from previous conversations as we're pulling this together, I know you kind of had some pieces on this. What does analytics mean to you?
Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as the method of logical analysis, which makes perfect sense. And the origin of the word analytics is actually Greek. It's the Greek word analyn, which means unloose. Almost seems like a double negative, but to me, I think of analytics more as a method of examining and analyzing data that helps me reach a conclusion. So the goal for me is to gain a new insight that will help me improve my business, really.
Thanks, Mike. And as I mentioned, we had some good conversations as we were pulling this together, right? And then, initially, I kind of got pulled in a little bit late, but you guys have been talking, and you wanted to present in a lot of ways, analytics and kind of how it can help. And one of the things that we discussed was the four basic principles. It seemed like all the conversations really revolved around four basic principles of analytics. And I know everyone's kind of got one that may be more near and dear to the heart, but I don't know if everyone can maybe just jump in and if there's one, if we can set the stage for the group here, maybe one in particular, if everyone can just take one and say, hey, this is what this this principle of analytics means to me.
Sure, Eric, I'll start with that. I'll take the most basic form is descriptive analytics, and it uses simple statistics to answer the basic what in decision making. So we all do this with calculating our financial ratios and other performance indicators, such as what's our average days in accounts receivable, or what's our return on equity, and things of that sort.
Absolutely. John, I know you got a good perspective on this as well.
Sure. I'll take the second one, diagnostics. So when we look beyond those basic descriptive analytics, we start looking at diagnostics, which uses statistics to consider relationships between variables, or essentially the why of decision making. So for an example, why are certain projects consistently more profitable than others, or why are we having scheduling trouble with this particular project? We use the diagnostics to determine what variables produce the best results, where those relationships exist, which variables are influencing outcome, and so ultimately leading to more informed managerial decisions. And that's what diagnostics is about.
And following diagnostics comes predictive analytics. Predictive analytics consists of studying historical data in order to identify patterns and correlation to help predict future trends and outcomes. A practical example of this is that Amazon and Apple, for instance, are very good, almost scary good, at analyzing my purchase history and suggesting new books and music that I might enjoy. So what does this mean in construction? It means that we can use data to help predict what jobs will actually cost to complete, how project teams are likely to perform, whether subcontract bids are reasonable, and other things like that. Really, how is this likely to turn out is really the question that predictive analytics answers. It can also be used to model cash flows and working capital.
So I'll jump in and take the last one, and that is prescriptive analytics. It's actually one of my favorites. It works with predictive, which involves, as Bryce just said, statistics and modeling. However, while predictive will give you an estimation of what's likely to happen, prescriptive analytics will recommend or prescribe a course of action. So, how can we make it happen? And not to get too nerdy here, but it uses advanced computational algorithms we can understand to really look at multivariate relationships. And again, all it is just prescribing a course of action. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're the CEO of a construction firm, and your goal is to maximize your resources and profit. By building a simple model, That includes past job performance by market, by type, size, and a few other factors. You can theoretically automate the go or no-go process when considering new work to pursue. Now, this would ensure that your business development team isn't wasting their time and the company is not taking on unnecessary risks. I'll just like to add this. This area is very uncomfortable territory for most construction managers. So the practical application of prescriptive analytics hasn't taken a strong hold in our industry, but I think in the future, we might see that changing.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, really good feedback from everyone there too. But I think what kind of dovetails into our next question, Bruce, is as you mentioned, practical application of this. I know we got 4 panelists from 4 very different backgrounds here, right? Obviously, we're all brought together through construction, but we have really different perspectives. And when you talk about that practical application, like you mentioned in that last piece, I think that's the key, right? Everything really begins with a question. And, in order to get to that practical application and exploring that, I think it really starts with what questions should contractors be asking themselves, especially right now, right? So I think, Bryce, I think you may have, and from talking to this previously, I think you got a lot to add here as far as what questions they can ask themselves.
Honestly, I think this is the most challenging aspect of analytics, figuring out what the right questions to ask are. Because once you start digging into issues, what may have seemed clear and obvious at the outset often become far less so. In the current environment, contractors are asking questions about how or if they need to right-size their operations to fit their market environment. And their key concerns revolve around cash flow and how to adjust their labor and equipment, if at all, in order to cash flow the business. Most contractors right now have backlog, but they're concerned about what their operations are going to look like when the backlog is, when they've completed the backlog. And the obvious problem is that our expectations of the future have become a great deal more uncertain in the last few months than they were previously. So how does a contractor make decisions about the size of its labor force and supervision in such an uncertain market environment? Well, a great place to start is by understanding deeply how its project teams are really performing. We all know which projects make money and which don't, but today we have tools that can tell a lot more of the story than that. And in general, the contractors that effectively and efficiently manage their labor are those that can best adapt to fluid market conditions. So today we can use data to help contractors analyze their labor productivity at a much deeper than surface level, and to help them figure out how much capacity in their labor and supervision they really have. Some of this just gets overlooked when the market environment is as strong as the one that we've just come out of. Information in hand, contractors are in a better position to respond to these market dynamics. And similar discussions are taking place with respect to optimum levels of equipment and other fixed costs. In my experience, there's often a difference between the perceived use of assets or what we instinctually think of how our assets and equipment are used and the actual use when the data is analyzed. So the key is that data can help us make decisions about what our labor force and supervision should look like and what our fixed costs should look like to help us better manage our cash flows.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Bryce. And you mentioned the decisions and kind of using that, those decisions are what's really going to guide the ship, right? Wick, I'm going to toss it to you in a second as far as, what questions are you're answering to ensure that's that the ship's heading in the right direction, if you will. But I would take this moment just to kind of pause, for all of our participants out there too. I know we're going through quite a bit of information and there's a lot out there. We got really good presenters. Feel free to jump in on that question box. I know we'll kind of get to them at the end, but as they come up, as Bryce and Wick and John and Bruce are going through these things, if something kind of piques your interest, you want to talk about it a little bit more, throw it in that question box. And then, also keep in mind, we'll probably have a poll midway through there as well. So just keep an eye on the bottom. Love to have some engagement as we go forward. But yeah, as I mentioned, Wick, to kind of get back to it, what questions are you answering to ensure that, the ship is headed in the right direction, so to speak?
Well, cash is always nearest and dearest to my heart, and it's the lifeblood really of every contractor. So the first question I ask myself is, what does my cash flow look like for the next 12 weeks, 6 months, and so on? So looking at short-term and long-term. And equally as important as cash flow is profitability, which obviously drives cash flow. And some of those questions might be, are my existing projects performing as efficiently as possible? Are we on budget? What's the revenue we'll complete this year? And does it fall in line with the overhead structure that we have in place? What does my backlog look like? And does it support those revenue projections? And what happens to overall profitability and cash flow if some of my backlog is delayed or canceled, which is certainly something likely to happen in this current economic climate? And then do I need to reduce my overhead in turn? And if so, when and by how much? So, in uncertain times like we're experiencing today, it's important to look at the big picture and have the ability to run several what-if scenarios. For instance, if I know what my bid hit rate is for certain types of projects, various market segments, client types, etc., I can evaluate my backlog without historical data to look at probable scenarios. So there's some tools that I like to use to do that, and dashboards and so forth that make it easier to get access to that information quickly. And what you're seeing now is an example of what that could look like for you, and obviously it could look anything like you'd want it to. But we've used Foundation for a long time, and so we're very familiar with it and able to create custom reports and mine information using Microsoft Query and Excel. So I know how to get what I need out of it, but it's still a manual and time-consuming effort to do that. Even to find the right table within Foundation to look for that information can be daunting. So a couple of years ago, we started working with ProNovos, and now I have a financial dashboard that I can customize and use that can monitor cash flow, profitability, backlog, other KPIs that may be important to me at that particular time. And it's a huge benefit to be able to press a button and know the health of the business as opposed to spending hours gathering and manipulating data and trying to make sense of it. So the great part about it is ProNovos pulls the data directly from Foundation and other software packages that we're using. So it's sort of a way to integrate all of that software into one front-end interface, and there's no duplicate entry of information. So it's very convenient for everything from financial information to estimating information, CRM data, project management, whatever it is that you want to see.
Cool. Yeah, and I know you got quite a bit in here, and I think this is pretty helpful too. And I think that segues pretty well to what John Killingsworth has. I know, John, you'll be getting to it in a little bit as far as some really good visuals and some really good data points that people can use. But maybe before we jump into that, from your research, what question or questions do you think are key for contractors to kind of maybe step back? These are the metrics that we use to get there, but if we step back one step and say, hey, what questions are key, then we can jump in and see what kind of metrics that we need as well, right?
Yeah, sure. So a practical application of analytics right now, considering the downturn, economic sort of uncertainty, is how do we manage our overhead? And we're all wanting to maintain a competitive balance between our overhead and our revenue levels, but we also fear losing really good people, knowing one that if we let them go, they'll experience significant hardship personally, and these are people that we care about, right? But also knowing we have to stay profitable, we have to manage a business, and keep it in mind, right? It's more expensive to get them back during recovery periods, and it's expensive to train new people. So my research question actually that I've been working on is actually very closely related to what Bryce talked about, what Wick just talked about, and specifically looking at this basic question: how do I manage my overhead, particularly the fixed personnel costs, in order to maintain a competitive balance in this industry?
Absolutely. Yeah, and John, I know personnel has been on everybody's mind. At least that's what I heard a lot, even prior to this going on, right? But obviously, there's an additional emphasis, with everything going on. So obviously, personnel, or overhead, and specifically personnel is clutch. But yeah, as we jump over to your screen here, yeah, I'd love to see, I'd love for you to show the group, some of these visuals and kind of how you work through that, and maybe provide some insight from your side.
Sure. Let me share my screen. It's a whiteboard. So, so this is basically, this is what I call my Pink Floyd graph with money and time, and so we look at, for instance, at a given point in time, we look at our revenue levels, and hopefully this is the trend, right? That we're heading in that positive direction. We all have variable costs, and those tend to track with revenue. They'll increase proportionately with revenue. And so what's left over is our fixed costs, and those tend to stay constant within a range of revenue, right? It's relative. And of course, then that little gap that's left over is our profits. And if we can increase revenues and maintain our fixed costs, well then, right, our profits will increase. So let's take an example, a typical construction company that's making 103,000 or 103 million in annual revenues, right? Typical fixed costs, right, on the high end would be about 5.4%. And again, variable costs are going to stay, right around 92%, give or take. And so at this level, our profits are, 2.6%. These are industry averages here that I've been able to get from my research. So as we move forward in time, our fixed costs are staying constant at that 4.6 million, but now we're increasing our revenue, and so now we're at 133 million. Variable costs are going to continue to track at the same, but you can see right now, right, that our profits have increased because our fixed costs are constant. Of course, we'll get to a point where our fixed personnel costs specifically are getting strained, and we start to see indications of inefficiencies. And the research indicates that point is right around 1.6% of total revenue. Again, you can see that fixed cost constant at 4.6 million. And again, this is just an example of an average company that's increasing in revenue. We're maximizing our profits here, but we're also maximizing our efficiency of fixed costs. So there has to be a decision made. What are we going to make that step up in our fixed costs, right? And as we do, of course, that eats into our profits. But if there's a continuing revenue trend forward, then we know, right, we're making the appropriate adjustment. If we delay that process, of course, we're going to increase our profits significantly, but we're also going to see more turnover, right, as we overload that personnel. So that's a big concern in this scenario, where we're looking at the potential of a downturn and our trend in revenue might be headed downward. We're holding on to that fixed personnel or those fixed costs, right? And then we can see, right, our profits will begin to tighten up. So we've got to make a decision here. Do we hold on to that, all those great people, or do we downstep? And so if we make the step down here, we can still observe some profit gains, but that means we're letting go of good people, right? So that's the strategy, but managerial sort of decision making that we've got to make. You can delay that adjustment and hold on to those fixed personnel, but we also know, right, that that's going to eat into our profits. We're going to experience loss in that case, right? So actually, let me switch this back over to you then. If you want to take back, I think this graphic is also in your slide deck. Hello.
I know Xenia may have it as well. We'll see if she can just jump back in and take that slide back here.
Tell you what, I'll just keep talking, and when you switch it over, I'll switch it.
While Xenia's jumping over there, actually, we have a really good question, and maybe you can touch on this real briefly too, or you can get to it at the end. I was going to say we did have a question pop up. Our participants, do they know their fixed costs? Is there a way to calculate what their annual revenue should be? And again, I was thinking maybe we'd ask it in between slides while we were transitioning back to the PowerPoint here, but you can either touch on that. Maybe we can jump back to it at the end too. John, you tell me what fits best.
Yeah, tell you what. So in fact, the slide following this one has a formula to be able to calculate that. So I'm gonna hold on to that question because that's a great question. But I think we'll get to it on the very next slide. So let me build into that. Yeah, come on back. Okay, perfect. So in this case, right, so here's where our company was that we were looking at. They were in this range, making 150 million, give or take, right? And so this table, what it does is it tells you what the industry is doing in terms of its fixed personnel costs. And the average company that's doing 150 million, right, between 130 and 160, is going to spend about 3.5% on average on fixed personnel costs. And their upper limit, meaning right where it gets tight, they're going to observe some inefficiencies at this level, 1.7%. And when you get to that, right, you're experiencing burnout. And when you're on the lower limit, you're spending quite a bit more on fixed personnel. And so they're not quite as busy, but that's so that lower limit's where you want to step into. So if that gives you an idea where the industry is performing, the idea is that, right, if you're in one of these categories, you can put yourself in terms of revenue in one of these categories. You can use this percentage to calculate, where your competition basically is behaving between these ranges. So if you go to the next slide, this is basically the same information, but you can see it graphically. And here's our trend line. As companies grow in terms of their revenue size, we can see that they're spending less proportionately on fixed personnel. That it doesn't mean they're spending less dollars, just percentage of that revenue is decreasing. So using this, really your basic slope formula, this is how you can answer that question. If I know my fixed costs, why, I can use this formula basically to calculate where I should be in terms of revenue in order to be competitive. Or if you know what your projected revenue is, substitute that number for X, and that'll give you a good idea, right, of what your budget should be for your fixed cost. So you can use it either way in that managerial decision making.
Look at that. Cool. Well, thanks, John. Obviously, that tied in pretty well. I said we hold the questions to the end, but it worked out, while we were kind of transitioning there. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, thanks. And this is awesome information. And, I know at the end, this is quite a bit of information here. Email Bruce if you have any questions, or if you're not on the email, if you don't see an email list of this coming through, shoot an email to Bruce, or he should have the slides for you. He'll be able to get you what you need, because I know John went through quite a bit of really good information here than Wick previously as well, as far as like graphically what's on the screen here. But as we kind of get back into it a little bit, speaking of Bruce, you know, I know you work with a number of construction executives, right? And you work on data strategy, analytical enablement, you know, taking this information and utilizing it and so forth. You know, you're talking through with them what are key questions that they need to be asking and so forth. So the whole theme of this really is questions, and you know, I know it's analytics, but it's what questions should they be asking? And I think you're in a really good position to ask that, or at least share your perspective and some light on that, right, Bruce?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about how to answer that, and that's a tough one. And really, I think it all depends on the contractor's individual situation right now. Also, keep in mind that I don't work in a construction firm, but I am in a very unique situation of having the privilege of knowing the questions construction companies are asking. So a few weeks ago, it was all about the federal Paycheck Protection Program. When we looked at the top queries on our server, we saw complex questions related to headcount and pay wages. And really, that's not surprising given the type of information that the government was requesting. However, I was surprised by the number of complex what-if scenarios that were created. So I saw something like, for every one question, like how much did we pay in wages from 2019 to Q1 of this year, there was an average of 8 what-if scenarios. And, you know, I was like, wow, you know, it's great that people are taking advantage of analytics. And that really shows the power of analytics to, you know, add in those what-if scenarios when you have the questions to answer. Another time-sensitive question that I am seeing relates to cash flow, profit protection, and cash reserves. So, for instance, this graph has gained popularity recently because it identifies and it tracks the causes of slow receivables. And it also calculates the financial burden to finance negative cash flows. The recent interest in information like this tells me that companies are trying to tighten things up and improve the speed at which their customers are paying invoices. So you know, this is one example, and there's another graph that is actually answering the same question, but it provides a slightly different way of looking at the information. And I'm really excited to see the use of our platform during times like this. But you know, there are additional questions that will be increasingly important as we get closer to 2021, and it'll be more strategic in nature. So I think that it's important to know what the demand outlook for your services will look like, what's driving that demand, and how can you anticipate these demands changing over time. And really, it's strategic decisions ultimately are based on the degree of assumptions about how our new world will unfold. And to improve the chances for a successful outcome, these assumptions must be continuously monitored and tested while trying to implement them. And this is very difficult to do without the right analytical tools. So, you know, I truly believe that that as we get, you know, more into the year of 2020, the questions will change and the level of complexity to answer those questions will change as well. And I think, you know, again, having strong analytics will keep most contractors above, you know, their competitors.
Absolutely, Bruce, and that's key, right? I mean, we spent a lot of this time talking about analytics, right, and having key analytics, finding the right analytics, showing them the right way, and stuff like that. But I think Wick, you know, you're in a unique position of all of us here. You know, being a true practitioner, we got this data, right? Bruce has shown us this beautiful graph, and charts and all this beautiful data and all these ways we can utilize analytics. But I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really mean much if you don't put it into practice, right? I mean, if you got all the data, you have all the data in the world, but unless you're actually using it and getting your organization to buy in and using it to take informed action, it's really not, it's not going to help your business. But I mean, how have you, it sounds like you've done it, and I know we've talked, how have you kind of taken that step, taken that leap from, hey, great, we have all this awesome information. How do you kind of create the organizational environment and, take that jump from we have it to, hey, we have it and we're using it and we're going from there?
That's a great question, Eric. And, we years ago spent more time trying to find data, mine it, make sense of it. And by the time we did all of that, we were worn out and gave up. And, I think that's common in construction. We're typically very old school, slow to adapt to new technologies and thought processes and so forth. And, from early days of construction, we've always known some metrics, such as how many yards of concrete should a crew pour in a day, what's the best ratio of field to office personnel, and things of that sort. And we all look at historical data, always have, such as financial statements, WIP reports, agings, all of that stuff. And each of those is that part of being informed. But by its own nature, being informed is a passive form. So you have information, but you're not using it to determine your future actions. So going the next step forward, taking informed actions, is taking all that information that you've gathered over the years, sorting through it, identifying metrics and trends, and then using that information to predict future outcomes. That's acting with informed information, or acting informed. So, I encourage every contractor to take the plunge into data. Really, you'll be amazed at the information you have at your fingertips that you already have, and that you can help make better decisions and make those decisions even faster. And in uncertain times, economic times like we're in right now, you need to use every tool in your toolbox, and especially the ones you didn't even know that you had. So embrace the data and understand what it's telling you. Take action, monitor the results, adjust course, and repeat. It's all about continuous improvement in my mind, and as long as you can measure it, you can manage it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Wick. And I think that kind of, like all of the structured questions we have, that seems like the majority of them here. I know we got a couple of questions in from the audience, but before we jump into those, again, want to thank everybody for participating today. Wick, Bryce, John, Bruce, and again, if you guys have any pointed questions or direct, obviously you have 4 different perspectives. If there's anything I can lend, which probably different, these guys are the experts in a lot of what we're talking about today. Feel free to send any of us questions directly if you have any, and people would be happy to help. I think that's the key here too. And Wick, you hit it on the last piece. There is, information is critical, and you got to make decisions quickly, and you got to be informed. But part of that information, aside from all the analytics, is working together. And I think everyone coming together to help put this together today is a great example of that. And everyone's kind of been beating the drum of, treat other people well and do things right. And I think working with you guys has been fantastic, and any help we can provide to each other and to everyone out here, I know it'll go a long way. So, and on that note, with some of these questions that we have, I think we're getting a little technical here, but this may show up, go right to John. But if anyone else wants to chime in, be my guest. We talked about fixed costs when you were going through a lot of your prepared material, John. But can you clarify, what exactly goes into that fixed cost? And I think Wick and Bryce, I can see definitely adding a bit to this too. But they mentioned personnel costs. Is there things like insurance, utilities, typical overhead costs? What all do you guys qualify as a fixed cost in that measure?
Yeah, so so fixed costs, absolutely. Right. Generally speaking, that's your overhead. So all your direct costs are variable costs, and then you've got those indirect costs that are the supervision of your projects and those kind of things. Those tend to be more variable costs that will track with revenue increase with revenue. Your fixed costs are usually associated with those costs that are not dependent on the project itself, the construction activity. So your estimating department and your HR and your accounting department, all that personnel for the most part is fixed, and obviously the building that they work in and the desks that they sit at and all of those kind of things are for the most part fixed. There is of course some variability in a little bit of that, right? If you hire an intern from CSU, for instance, from the CM program, which I highly recommend doing, but that's a variable cost to that overhead, and you're only going to do that when your revenues are demanding it. Obviously the overtime kind of things, considerations, that's a variable portion of that overhead. But for the most part, your G&A is fixed.
This
Bryce,
is Bryce. I'll jump in a little bit there. The accounting definition of a fixed cost is one that does not change with volume. So in addition to some of those that John mentioned, I'd say generally costs of ownership or leasing assets. So equipment ownership costs are definitely fixed costs, but not the operating costs. Yard expenses, John talked about office staff and supervisory staff that's paid on a salary basis. Those are the big ones that we typically see as fixed costs.
Cool. I think that's pretty helpful. I know a lot of people are probably asking for, a lot of those same questions right now too. So we did have one more we had queued up here too. Kevin asks, for any company, is it easy to determine the volume of work which is optimum for each project manager to handle? So assuming that, what he mentions is assuming that the work intensity for each manager is different in different companies. But I guess what he's getting at too is maybe another data point here, which we can try and drive is, volume of work, optimal volume of work per project manager. And maybe you guys can, I'm sure all you guys have really good different perspectives on that. I don't know who wants to jump in on that first, but.
I'll jump in on that. That's the Wick. Is it easy? I don't know that it's easy, but we certainly have created what we call capability models. And not only for project management, we do the same thing for estimators. And some of it is obviously based on the level of experience. So we would expect a senior project manager to be able to manage more work than a more junior project manager. But you can do that by looking back through the data that you've collected for each project manager. What volume of work have they managed throughout the year? So you can look at the profitability to see, does there become a point where that volume increases to the level where you start to see some profit fade on the jobs? And I know in our business, some of the big variables that are really hard to pinpoint exactly are project managers are very busy at the beginning of a job and at the end of the job. And in the middle, it kind of slows down a bit. So, if for us, $2 million job is probably an average job. And so senior project manager should be able to do maybe 5 of those a year. But if you had all 5 of them starting at the same time, that guy is going to be absolutely overwhelmed. So there's a little bit of common sense that you have to weigh into it as well, but you definitely can come up with dollar values for capability of those folks. And it's a great way when you're doing your budgeting and planning. If you're growing the business and you're starting the conversation with a certain volume of revenue, you need to know how many project managers you're going to need to have to do that amount of revenue. Then you need to know your hit rate as to how many jobs you're going to have to bid in order to get that volume of revenue. And then you need to know how many estimators will you need to bid that volume of work to get what you want to do. So you're right on track with that question, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rick. And I know, guys, initially when we started here, we said about 40 minutes. We're running a little bit over, but I appreciate everybody sticking around to help answer some questions. So, and everyone that's kind of stuck in around for the participation side. It seems like we got one more, if you guys don't mind. We'll hit one more question. And this one is kind of specific again to the fixed cost. It seems like kind of a hot topic today, and using that measure. But some of the costs are both fixed and variable. For example, insurance that has a minimum premium. Do you break these two into separate costs and that you can capture the fixed and variable portion separately?
Bryce, I think this is a good one for you.
Oh, I love accounting questions. So I think so. I think you need to. And I'll just say that the real benefit of understanding the difference between a fixed cost and a variable cost in terms of a contractor's performance is that it helps you understand your true costs of performance. And invariably what I've seen in my career is that the more sophisticated a contractor becomes, the deeper their understanding of their true cost of operations. So I would argue that a contractor who is able to split the variable and fixed component of something like insurance and then be able to reflect that in their ongoing, bids, estimates, and then job costing is a contractor that's going to over time outperform a contractor who doesn't have that level of sophistication. Now, this doesn't happen overnight, but that's the long answer. The short answer is yes, absolutely. I think it's to your benefit to understand and split the variable versus fixed components of any cost, such as insurance.
Absolutely. No, great answer, Bryce. I think that's pretty helpful. So I think that's all we got time for, at least question-wise. But I know we ran a touch over. But again, for everyone that's participating here today, everyone that's joined us in, keep an eye out for your email. Hopefully, you'll get a copy of this recorded. If not, if you see over there on the right-hand side of your screen, bruce.orr@pronovos.com, Bruce can get you a copy of this recorded webinar. Obviously, with the recorded webinar, you'll have everybody's information on there. You'll have Wick, Bryce, John, and then myself. I think I'm on the slide before, on another slide there too, edv@foundationsoft.com. Feel free to reach out to any of us too. Very, very happy to have you guys all join us today. Hopefully you guys got some good information out of this. I know we kind of put something together, somewhat recently for this, but, I don't think it's out of the question that we, if you guys got good information out of this, that we put something together again soon. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I know Bruce, you kind of hinted at it. I know nothing's formalized yet, but keep an eye out, keep your ear to your email. And I think we'll maybe get something together again soon if we got some good value out of this. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing concrete. I'm not going to marry anybody to anything, but yeah, if we get some good feedback, yeah, maybe this is something we can do again. But again, thanks to everybody here, especially Bruce, for kind of pulling these things together, getting you guys the good information, and keep an eye on your email. And thanks again for joining. Stay safe out there, be well, and take care, everybody. We'll see you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
Thanks,
Appreciate
guys.
it.
See ya.
Bye-bye.